Thomas Green has everything: power, wealth, a skyline filled with his name. But behind the glass walls of his Chicago penthouse, he's utterly alone. One day, during a quiet charity visit to a children's orphanage, a young boy named Evan points to a photo on the wall and whispers, "That's my dad." That photo? It's Thomas. What starts as a strange coincidence spirals into a haunting rediscovery of a love Thomas lost decades ago, and a child he never knew existed. But just as Thomas dares to open his heart, a legal battle, media frenzy, and corporate pressure threaten to tear it all apart. Will he protect the boy who calls him Dad, even if it costs him everything? Don't miss this emotional story of love, truth, and second chances. Subscribe now for more unforgettable stories. Thomas Green stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, a steaming espresso cup warming his hand against the biting wind that swept across the city of Chicago. Below him, the skyline shimmered beneath a gray November morning, all steel and ambition, much like the man himself. At 55, Thomas was the kind of success story magazines still loved to print. Real estate tycoon, CEO of Green Holdings, the mind behind some of the city's most iconic developments. Yet, in the polished glass of the towering windows around him, there was no reflection of family, no trace of a home lived in. Only a man, impeccably dressed and hauntingly alone. He didn't think much about it anymore, not out loud, at least. Most days began like this: quiet, methodical, emotionless. His assistants had his schedule memorized to the minute. His calls were filtered, his emails triaged. And, if there was a moment, just a flicker, when he passed the spare room down the hall and felt an old ache rise in his chest, he'd swallow it down with his double espresso. Feelings didn't build skyscrapers. But memories? They had a way of climbing back. On his desk sat a photo, half buried under paperwork, framed in walnut. It hadn't been touched in years. A younger Thomas, far less refined, smiling beside a woman with chestnut curls and a defiant sparkle in her green eyes. Claire. The name still echoed like a closed door. 15 years ago, she had been everything. His world, his muse, his softness in a life made of deadlines and spreadsheets. A brilliant painter who saw color where he only saw contracts. They met in college, fell too hard, too fast, and fell apart just as quickly when Thomas's mother, cold, calculating, and fiercely protective of the family's name, dug into Claire's background and found just enough poverty to deem her unworthy. Thomas, too spineless at the time to stand against the tide, watched her leave with tears in her eyes and dignity intact. He never saw her again. He never forgave himself either. "Sir, your car is ready," came a voice through the intercom, interrupting the silence. James, his driver of over 2 decades. Dependable. Silent when needed. Thomas grabbed his coat. Today wasn't about deals or acquisitions. It was about legacy, or at least the illusion of it. The ribbon cutting at St. Mary's Orphanage was scheduled for 10 a.m. Green Holdings had sponsored the construction of a new classroom wing, and Thomas had insisted on attending. Not out of vanity, he hated cameras, but because it was expected, a gesture of goodwill, a carefully framed photo op. The drive through the city was uneventful, but as they pulled through the black iron gates of St. Mary's, something unexpected stirred in him. Maybe it was the faint echoes of laughter from the courtyard. Maybe it was the crisp scent of fallen leaves and distant pine from the orphanage's aging oaks. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that had been locked away for too long. Inside, the staff greeted him with warm professionalism. Sister Margaret, who had run the orphanage for over 30 years, gave him a gracious tour. Her presence was steady, like the creak of old wood beneath steady feet. "We're so grateful, Mr. Green," she said sincerely. "This new wing will change lives." He nodded, offering a rare, genuine smile. Happy to contribute. They moved through the halls, sunlight streaming in through stained glass windows, until they reached the corridor of photographs, portraits of benefactors and alumni lining the walls like silent witnesses. Thomas paused when they came to his picture, a formal portrait taken 5 years ago, sharp suit, indifferent smile. It was then that he heard it. "Miss Jenna," a small voice whispered from behind. "That's my dad." Thomas turned slowly. A little boy stood near the doorway, no older than 7. Curly brown hair, slightly messy. Big brown eyes, too deep for his age, locked onto Thomas's image on the wall. The teacher beside him froze, glancing nervously between the boy and the man in question. "I'm sorry," she began, trying to gently hush him. "Evan, sometimes—" "What did he say?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet but firm. The boy stepped forward, unafraid, and pointed again. "That's my dad. My real dad." Time seemed to stutter. The hallway, the voices, even Sister Margaret's soft gasp all faded as Thomas stared at the child. Something inside him, a feeling he'd buried beneath concrete and glass, broke free like a tremor, the boy's face. There was something hauntingly familiar in the shape of his eyes, in the curve of his mouth. A memory stirred. Claire's eyes. Claire's laughter. "Evan," the teacher said more insistently, trying to guide him away. But Thomas knelt slowly, unsure what possessed him to do so. "Why do you think that's your dad, Evan?" The boy shrugged, not with confusion, but with childlike certainty. "Because Mom said he was strong, and smart, and looked just like that." "Your mom?" Thomas's throat tightened. "She couldn't keep me," Evan said softly, "but she loved me. She said one day maybe my real dad would find me." Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't move. And just like that, the ground beneath everything he thought he knew began to shift. Thomas didn't move for a long moment, the name Evan echoing in his mind like a ripple across water that refused to settle. The boy's calm declaration had split something open inside him, something that had been sealed away with glassy detachment for more than a decade. Sister Margaret gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Green," she said softly, her voice reverent yet urgent, "perhaps we should step into my office." He stood, slow and deliberate, eyes still on the child who now stood between the past and his heart. Evan's face had gone slightly red, unsure if he'd said something wrong, but Thomas forced a kind smile and nodded toward the teacher. "May I speak with him for a moment?" he asked. The young teacher, Miss Jenna, hesitated. "He's not in trouble, is he?" "No," Thomas said quietly. "Just the opposite, I think." She stepped aside, and Sister Margaret led the way to a modest room just down the corridor. It smelled faintly of peppermint and old books. Safe, unassuming. Evan followed, gripping the hem of his sweater, his eyes darting curiously between the two adults. Once the door clicked shut, Thomas lowered himself into a worn leather chair across from Evan. "Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" His tone was careful, like a man testing the strength of ice before stepping out onto it. Evan nodded. "Do you remember your mom? What was her name?" "Claire," Evan replied instantly. "Claire Bennett." The air left Thomas's lungs in a sharp exhale. Claire. The same Claire who once painted his portrait while humming Billie Holiday. The same Claire who used to tuck notes in his briefcase with doodles of cupcakes and stars. Claire who had disappeared without a trace after their final, soul-breaking fight. Evan, oblivious to the storm rolling behind Thomas's eyes, continued innocently. "She used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep. She liked daisies and used to say that names were like flowers. You just needed someone to water them." Thomas cleared his throat. "What happened to her, Evan?" "She got really sick," the boy said, looking down. "She told me to be brave, that someone kind would take care of me. Then one day, she was just gone." There was a silence in the room that stretched and ached. Sister Margaret offered a gentle nod of confirmation. "Evan was found on the steps of the Children's Hospital," she said solemnly, "wrapped in a blanket, with a note tucked under his arm. No return address. It simply said, 'Please love him like I did.'" Thomas clenched his jaw, his hand curling into a fist on the armrest. "He had this with him," Margaret added, standing and retrieving a small plastic bag from her file cabinet. Inside was a well-worn children's book, The Little Prince, its corners frayed, its cover soft from use. She passed it to Thomas. He opened it slowly, and on the inside cover, scrawled in Claire's looping handwriting, was a note. "To Evan, with all my love. Claire loves Thomas. 2001." The ink swam in front of his eyes. "Do you recognize it?" Margaret asked gently. Thomas nodded, voice catching. "She used to read it to me when I couldn't sleep. We were just kids. But she believed in stories. Believed they could carry us through anything." Miss Jenna tapped softly on the door. "Sorry to interrupt. The other children are gathering for lunch. Evan, are you hungry, sweetheart?" Evan looked at Thomas hesitantly. "Can he come too?" Thomas blinked, startled by the invitation. Before he could answer, Margaret gave him a look, one layered with cautious hope. "If you're willing," she said, "it might be good for both of you." The cafeteria buzzed with the sound of children laughing, forks clinking against trays, and the faint echo of cartoons playing on a distant TV. Thomas sat at a child-sized table, knees awkwardly wedged beneath, while Evan munched happily on macaroni and cheese beside him. The boy leaned against him like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Do you come here a lot?" Evan asked. Thomas smiled faintly. "Not often enough. I hope you come more," the boy said without looking up. "You feel nice, like safe nice." Thomas blinked against the sudden sting in his eyes. His fingers trembled as he reached into his pocket and felt the letter again. Claire's handwriting, her farewell. After lunch, he walked out alone, the sky overcast now, a cold breeze sweeping through the trees that lined the orphanage's lot. James opened the car door, clearly sensing something had shifted. "Where to, sir?" Thomas hesitated. "Back home," he said, "and call Dr. Kessler's office. I want to schedule a paternity test." James's eyebrows twitched, but he said nothing, just nodded and drove. As the city rose up around him again, towers of ambition and isolation, Thomas pressed his forehead against the window. For the first time in decades, he felt something stir inside him that wasn't hunger for power or profit. It was simpler, deeper. A child had called him father. And he needed to find out if it was true. The sterile, white envelope felt heavier than any contract Thomas Green had ever signed. It sat on his mahogany desk like a quiet sentinel, mocking his hesitation. He had faced down billion-dollar negotiations, hostile boardroom takeovers, even a near-death accident in his 30s. But this single piece of paper held a truth his soul wasn't sure it was ready to confront. The phone on his desk buzzed once. James. "Dr. Kessler sent the results by courier. Shall I come in?" Thomas stared at the envelope. "No need, James. I'll call when I need you." As the city glowed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 48th floor penthouse, Thomas sat down slowly, fingers trembling as they slipped under the seal. The DNA report was crisp, clinical, columns of percentages and markers, but his eyes zeroed in on one line. Probability of paternity, 99.98%. He didn't move. For a full minute, the silence swallowed everything. The soft ticking of the grandfather clock faded beneath the roar in his ears. Then something gave, something deep, buried, and brittle. Tears. Hot, quiet tears he hadn't known he still had in him. He turned in his chair to face the window. Below him, Chicago pulsed with ambition, with noise and urgency, but he didn't see any of it. He saw Claire, barefoot in their tiny college apartment, laughing as she smeared paint across his cheek. He saw the letter in the back of the storybook, and now he saw Evan, wide-eyed and unknowing, reaching for a man who had no idea he was already a father. His phone rang again. It was Dr. Kessler. "Mr. Green, I hope you've had a chance to review the report." "I have." Thomas's voice cracked. "There's no doubt, is there?" "None whatsoever. Evan is your biological son." The words settled over him like snowfall, cold at first, then blanketing, final, unchangeable. After he hung up, Thomas did something he hadn't done in decades. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a photo album covered in soft navy leather. Most pages were empty, but near the beginning were a handful of pictures. College years. Claire in a sundress. Claire painting. Claire holding up a sonogram photo, smiling nervously. That photo had once been the start of something. It had become the end. Until now, he snapped the album shut. The following morning, Thomas arrived at St. Anne's Orphanage again, this time without an entourage, without a suit, just a cardigan and slacks, and a paper bag filled with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches he'd awkwardly made himself that morning. "Mr. Green," Sister Margaret greeted him with surprise. "We weren't expecting you so soon." "I was hoping," he said gently, "to see Evan again." She studied him for a long moment, eyes soft but wise. "He's in the reading room. Come." Inside, Evan sat cross-legged on a patchwork rug, his nose buried in the little prints. Thomas hesitated at the doorway, the image almost too perfect to disturb. The boy looked so small, and yet carried the poise of someone older, someone who'd had to be strong too soon. "Hey, Evan," Thomas said quietly. The boy looked up. His eyes lit up in surprise. "You came back." "I said I would," Thomas replied, smiling despite the ache in his chest. "Mind if I join you?" Evan scooted to the side, making space beside him. "This book's my favorite," he said, flipping the page. "Mom used to read it. She said it was for people who missed someone." Thomas sat slowly. She was right. There was a long pause. "Can I ask you something?" Evan said, without looking up. "Of course. Do you think moms go to the same heaven as dads, even if they weren't married?" Thomas blinked, caught off guard by the innocence and gravity packed into that single sentence. He cleared his throat, swallowing emotion. "I think heaven doesn't care about paperwork. I think love is what matters." Evan nodded solemnly. "Good. Then maybe Mom's watching me. Watching us." Thomas turned his head away briefly, wiping a tear. "I think she's proud of you. Very proud." He didn't say us. Not yet. Not until the time was right. Over the next week, Thomas returned every day. He played board games with Evan in the common room, helped him with fractions, listened as the boy talked about his dreams of becoming a pilot, so I can fly wherever I want. Each day, Evan's laugh grew easier, his eyes brighter. But Thomas felt the weight of his secret with every visit. He spoke with Sister Margaret privately one evening. "I need to tell him the truth soon," he confessed. "I just don't want to shatter the trust we've built." "Truth doesn't shatter," she said gently. "Lies do. You're not a stranger anymore, Thomas. You're what he's always hoped for." Thomas swallowed hard. "And what if I fail him?" "You won't," she said with quiet certainty. "You already didn't." As he left the orphanage that night, Evan ran out after him. "Wait." Thomas turned. "Tomorrow. Can we play chess again?" Thomas knelt down, eyes level with the boy's. "I'd like that more than anything." And as Evan hugged him tightly with the small arms full of unknowing love, Thomas knew there would be no turning back. It was well past midnight when Thomas Green found himself seated at the edge of his bed, a soft storybook resting in his hands. The Little Prince. The copy had been worn at the edges, the spine frayed from small fingers turning its pages again and again. It wasn't the exact same one Evan had been reading at the orphanage, but its presence now, on his nightstand, hand-delivered by Sister Margaret earlier that day, felt just as sacred. "There's something inside," she had whispered with care. "We thought you should see it. It's Evan's most treasured possession." Now, under the soft lamplight, Thomas carefully opened the front cover. On the inside page, a faded ink inscription brought his breath to a halt. To Thomas, when you feel lost, remember the stars. Claire, Spring 2001. His heart clenched. Claire, the name alone, held echoes of a life left behind, of warmth and laughter, of paintbrushes and teacups, and late-night talks about galaxies and grace. That handwriting hadn't changed. He would have recognized it anywhere. She had given this book to him once upon a time, and now it belonged to their son. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, pressing the book against his chest. His jaw tightened as he tried to contain the tidal wave rising inside him. He hadn't thought about Claire in years, at least not with clarity. For so long, he had filed those memories away under regret and impossibility. And yet here she was again, reaching through time with a whisper from the past. He turned to the last page of the book, where Claire had written a longer message in her familiar, looping cursive. "If you're reading this, maybe you found him too. His name is Evan. He's everything good in the world. I never stopped loving you, but I had to let you go. I hope one day you'll understand. Love, always. C." Thomas's breath caught. His fingers shook as they traced the edges of the page. She knew. She knew he might find him someday. He closed the book, held it in both hands, and bowed his head. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the steady hum of the city lights through the window. Then he rose, moved to his desk, and pulled out a yellow legal pad. He didn't hesitate. To Evan, the words came easily. Finally, after all these years. He wrote for an hour, pouring out a letter he never thought he'd get to write. He wrote about Claire, about college, about the dreams they once shared and the silence that followed. He told Evan about his own fears, about the moment he first heard the boy call him Dad without even knowing it. And then, gently, he ended it. "I didn't know, Evan, but I do now, and nothing means more to me than being the father you deserve, if you'll let me." The next day at the orphanage, Thomas carried the book with him, wrapped in tissue and tied with twine. It wasn't time yet to explain everything, but it was time to start pulling back the curtain. Evan was waiting in the reading room, seated at their usual spot near the tall window. When he saw Thomas, his eyes brightened like morning sun. "You came early." "I couldn't wait," Thomas said, setting the package down. "I brought something." Evan eyed it curiously. "Is it for me?" Thomas nodded. "Go ahead. Open it." The boy unwrapped it carefully. When he saw the familiar cover of The Little Prince, his brows furrowed. "I already have this." "Look inside," Thomas prompted gently. Evan flipped open the cover, and the moment he saw the inscription, his lips parted. "Hey, this is just like mine," he whispered. "It is yours," Thomas said softly. "But your mom gave it to me first, a long time ago." Evan looked up, confused. "You knew my mom?" Thomas smiled, tenderly, almost painfully. "She was my best friend, my everything, before life got complicated." Evan seemed to consider this, his small fingers brushing over Claire's name. "She used to talk about stars a lot," he said thoughtfully. "She said people you love become part of the sky." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "She always believed in magic like that." "Did you stop believing?" "For a long time," Thomas admitted, "but not anymore." Evan was quiet. Then, hesitantly, "Are you gonna disappear too?" Thomas leaned in close, eye level with the boy. "No, I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever." And when Evan unexpectedly reached forward and hugged him, small arms clinging, forehead pressed into Thomas's shoulder, Thomas finally allowed himself to breathe. "I don't remember my mom's face very well," Evan mumbled, "but I remember her voice." "She would be so proud of you," Thomas whispered back. "So proud." As the hug lingered, Thomas knew the wall between them had cracked just enough. The time for full truth was nearing. But for now, this moment, this shared storybook, this embrace, was enough. They had found each other again. Now they had to learn how to belong. The following days unfolded with an intensity Thomas hadn't expected. Each visit to the orphanage felt heavier, not in burden, but in the gravity of what they meant. There were no formal announcements, no declarations of truth, just the slow, deliberate rhythm of a bond forming between a man and the boy who shared his blood. Thomas wasn't ready to tell Evan everything. Not yet. But he needed to be there. He needed to show up. He began coming daily, reading with Evan in the mornings, helping with puzzles in the afternoon, sharing laughter during recess, even staying late to help Sister Margaret clean the lunchroom. His assistants at Green Properties were baffled. Meetings were pushed, calls rescheduled, and for the first time in years, Thomas ignored his calendar. He found himself at the bookstore one evening, browsing children's novels with a seriousness that startled the clerk. When asked who the books were for, Thomas paused before replying softly, "My son." The word still felt fragile on his tongue, but also right. So incredibly right. On a crisp Thursday morning, a loud knock came at the orphanage's back entrance. Sister Margaret opened the door to find Thomas standing there, flushed from the cold, arms full. "What in heaven's name?" she gasped. "I brought breakfast," Thomas said, cheeks red, slightly sheepish. "Thought the kids might like fresh bagels and hot cocoa." He moved past her before she could protest, setting up a spread on the long wooden table. The children, rubbing their eyes and blinking at the unexpected treat, gathered around eagerly. Evan was the last to arrive, still in his pajama shirt, hair tousled. When he saw Thomas pouring cocoa, his entire face lit up. "You're here early." Thomas ruffled his hair. "Didn't want to miss breakfast with you." Later, while the other children scattered to their morning classes, Evan lingered. They sat side by side on the wooden steps behind the building, wrapped in a borrowed quilt as their breath misted in the air. "Mr. Thomas?" "Yeah, kiddo? Why do you come here every day?" Thomas hesitated, his heart pounding. "I guess," he said carefully, "because there's someone here who matters to me. Someone I didn't know I was missing until I met him." Evan looked down at his hands. "Is it me?" Thomas couldn't speak right away. He placed a gentle hand on Evan's shoulder. "Yeah, Evan, it's you." Evan was quiet for a while, and Thomas thought maybe that was enough for now. But then the boy turned to him, eyes earnest. "I had a dream last night," he said. "I was in a hospital, and a man came in and said he was my dad. He had your voice." Thomas swallowed hard. "What happened in the dream?" Evan blinked slowly. "He stayed with me. Even when I got sick again. He didn't leave." The silence between them deepened, heavy and holy. "You think dreams can be true?" Evan whispered. "I think sometimes," Thomas replied, his voice trembling. "Dreams are the heart's way of telling us what we need, or maybe even what we're meant to find." That night, back in his penthouse apartment, Thomas couldn't sleep. He stood at the window, watching the city breathe beneath him, glass towers shimmering like silent sentinels, taxis slicing through shadows like yellow lightning. Yet, none of it brought him the comfort it once had. The luxury, the success, the empire. It all felt hollow now, pale in the comparison to the weight of a boy's trust. He wandered into his kitchen and pulled out a box tucked deep in one of the cabinets. Inside was a photo album he hadn't opened in a decade. And there she was, Claire, standing in front of a canvas, laughing as paint streaked her cheek, holding a mug of tea with both hands in his old college sweatshirt, sitting on their tiny studio couch, one hand on her stomach, eyes full of quiet hope. A photo he had forgotten stopped him cold. Claire in the park, sunlight in her hair, holding up a tiny onesie, smiling at the camera with something unspoken in her gaze. She'd kept the baby. She hadn't lied. He closed the album slowly, reverently. His hands rested on top of it, firm but tender, as if holding her memory still. This wasn't about guilt anymore. This was about stepping into something bigger than himself. Tomorrow, he decided, would be different. No more hiding behind questions. No more half-truths. Evan deserved the whole story, and so did Claire. And when the morning came, Thomas dressed not in his usual tailored suit, but in a warm flannel shirt and jeans. He pulled the old album into his bag, along with a small envelope, the letter he'd written days before. This time, he wouldn't walk into that orphanage as a visitor or a sponsor. He would walk in as a father, finally ready to be seen. The next morning, the sky over Chicago hung low, streaked with iron-gray clouds and the smell of an early snow. Thomas arrived at the orphanage just as the children were gathering for their morning story hour. But this time, he didn't come bearing treats or toys. He came carrying truth. In his hand was the old photo album, wrapped in a faded blue cloth. In his pocket, the letter he'd stayed up all night rewriting, scratching out every line until the words felt honest enough, soft enough, real enough. Evan was seated cross-legged on a rug in the reading room, leaning against Sister Margaret as she opened a copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. When he spotted Thomas in the doorway, his face broke into a radiant smile. He didn't say anything, just scooted aside on the rug, silently inviting Thomas to join. Thomas sat. He listened to the story's opening lines, the familiar ache in his chest deepening. When Sister Margaret paused to turn the page, he leaned toward her and whispered, "Could we talk privately for a few minutes?" Her expression changed, not startled, but quietly aware. "Of course," she murmured. "Evan, sweetheart, go get your sweater, will you? Mr. Green and I need to speak for a moment." Evan ran off, unconcerned, humming under his breath. In Sister Margaret's small office, Thomas laid the photo album on her desk. She looked at it, then at him, waiting. "I owe you transparency," he said gently, "and I owe Evan more than I can say." He opened the album. Claire's face smiled up from the first page. Sister Margaret leaned closer. Her breath caught audibly. "Is that—" "Yes, Claire Bennett. She was my fiancée. 23 years ago. We were in love, but my family—" His voice faltered. "My mother didn't approve. Claire came from a background she didn't consider appropriate for the Montgomery name. We broke it off. I thought she moved on." He turned the pages slowly. Pictures of Claire painting, laughing, arms around a younger Thomas, and then, near the back, the photo of her holding up the tiny onesie in the park. "She told me once she wanted children, but I never knew she had one. I never knew she had him." Sister Margaret sat back, hands folded tightly in her lap. When Evan arrived, he had no last name, no story, just a note, and this. She opened her drawer and pulled out a worn children's book, The Little Prince. Thomas stared at it, blinking hard. "Open it," she said softly. He did. Inside the front cover, in Claire's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For Evan. Your mother loves you more than all the stars, Claire." 2016. Thomas's hand trembled. "He's mine," he whispered. "I know," she replied gently. "Even before the DNA test, I saw it. The way he looks at you, the way he laughs like you, the same quiet strength. He is your son, Thomas. The only question left is, what are you going to do about it?" Just then, there was a knock at the door. Evan peeked in, still clutching his sweater. "Is it okay if I come in?" Thomas turned and smiled, rising to meet him. "Actually, Evan, I was hoping we could take a walk, just the two of us." Evan nodded, curious. "Sure." They walked in silence for a few blocks, bundled against the biting wind. Thomas led them to a bench in a small park tucked between buildings, where bare trees whispered overhead and pigeons fluttered along the sidewalk. "I brought something for you," Thomas said, pulling the letter from his coat pocket. Evan took it with both hands, looking up. "What is it?" "A letter. From someone very important. Someone I wish had been able to say these things herself." He watched as Evan unfolded the page, eyes moving slowly over the words. Claire's name appeared near the end. The boy's eyebrows furrowed. "She's my mom?" he asked softly. Thomas nodded, voice breaking. "Yes, she was brilliant, strong, kind, and she loved you more than anything. She didn't leave you because she didn't care. She left you because she had no other choice." Evan sat with the letter for a long time. "Is she gone?" he asked finally. "Yes," Thomas said gently. "She passed away when you were just a baby." Evan nodded, blinking back tears. "Did you love her? With everything I had, and everything I didn't know how to give." Evan turned his face away. "So, why didn't you come for me sooner?" Thomas's breath caught. He reached over and gently placed a hand on Evan's back. "I didn't know you existed, Evan. If I had known, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." They sat in silence, the wind rustling through the trees like a whispered apology. Then Evan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you my dad?" Thomas turned to him, eyes full, heart open. "I am, and if you'll let me, I'd like to be." Evan nodded slowly, then leaned into Thomas's side, resting his head against his chest. Thomas wrapped his arms around the boy and held him as the wind blew colder, but inside, something warm and fierce began to grow. He wasn't just a man learning how to be a father. He was a father. And nothing else in the world mattered more. The cold hit harder that week, slicing through the narrow streets of Chicago like glass. It was the kind of cold that pressed into your bones, unforgiving and absolute. Thomas had planned to visit the orphanage with more books and a board game Evan had mentioned, something with knights and castles, but that plan changed with a single call. "Mr. Green," Sister Margaret's voice trembled over the phone. "It's Evan. He has a high fever. We've taken him to the hospital. Mercy General." Thomas didn't wait. He dropped everything. Calls, contracts, and even a meeting with a London investor that had been on the calendar for 3 months. None of it mattered. Not anymore. 20 minutes later, he burst through the glass doors of Mercy General, his chest heaving with breathless urgency. The receptionist barely had time to look up before he asked, "Evan? 7 years old. He was brought in from St. Matthew's Orphanage." "Room 407, she replied, pointing down the hallway. He sprinted. Evan lay on the hospital bed, small and fragile beneath a sea of white sheets. His cheeks were flushed, his breathing shallow. An IV dangled beside him, beeping steadily. Sister Margaret sat in the corner, her hands clasped tightly in prayer, but she stood the moment Thomas entered. "He's been in and out of consciousness," she whispered tearfully. The doctors say it's a severe viral infection, complicated by dehydration. He hadn't said anything. Not until this morning. Thomas moved to Evan's side, dropping to his knees. The boy stirred, his brow furrowed in fevered confusion. "Mom?" he whispered. "No, buddy," Thomas said softly, brushing the damp curls from Evan's forehead. "It's me." Evan's eyes fluttered, then opened slightly. "You came." "Of course I came," Thomas choked. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Evan's hand reached out, feeble but searching. Thomas clasped it instantly, holding it with both of his. He couldn't believe how small the boy's fingers felt in his own, how light his frame was, and yet the weight of this child, his child, anchored Thomas to something he'd never known he needed so badly: purpose. "Are you really my dad?" Evan mumbled. Thomas leaned closer, his voice thick with emotion. "I am, and I promise you, I'll never leave again." The monitors continued their steady rhythm, but the world outside that room stopped. Thomas sat by the bed for hours, refusing to move even when the nurses offered a chair. He held Evan's hand through every restless twitch, every low groan, every quiet whimper for a mother no longer here. He whispered stories from his childhood, described the apartment he now wanted Evan to live in, even made up a tale about a squirrel who wore a tiny business suit and ran an acorn bank in the park. Somewhere in the middle of it, Evan's lips curled faintly at the corners. By the third night, the fever finally broke. Thomas had fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed, chin tucked to his chest. When he woke, Evan was sitting up slightly, sipping apple juice through a straw. His eyes were clearer, brighter, and he gave a small wave when Thomas blinked groggily awake. "You snore," Evan said hoarsely. Thomas laughed, too loud, too relieved. "Well, you've been warned." A nurse entered, smiling at the sight. "Looks like someone's feeling better." "I feel kind of like mashed potatoes," Evan said. "But warm ones." Thomas chuckled again, heart swelling. "I'll take warm mashed potatoes over fever any day." Later that evening, Sister Margaret returned, holding a stuffed lion in her arms. "Thought you could use a brave friend tonight," she said, handing it to Evan. "Thanks, sister," Evan murmured, hugging it to his chest. When she stepped outside, Thomas followed her into the hallway. "He's going to be okay, right?" he asked, still unable to shake the dread clinging to his spine. The nun nodded, her voice tender. "Yes, he's strong, but, Thomas, he's more than just strong. He believes in people, even after everything he's been through. That's rare." Thomas looked through the glass window back at the boy who now meant more to him than any skyscraper or stock ticker ever could. "I want to bring him home," he said quietly, "as soon as he's cleared. I want to be his father, legally, emotionally, fully. I want to be what Claire never got to see." Sister Margaret studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then you'll need to start the paperwork immediately. And be prepared. Some people might question your motives." "I don't care," he said. "Let them question. I'm not walking away again." Back in the room, Evan looked up at Thomas and asked, "If I go home with you, do I still get to see Sister Margaret?" "Of course," Thomas replied, smoothing the blankets over him. "She's part of the family now, too." Evan seemed to accept that. Then he tilted his head. "Do dads cook?" Thomas hesitated. "This one's been known to burn toast." "Good." Evan grinned sleepily. "Then we'll learn together." As Thomas watched his son drift off into a peaceful sleep, he realized that the boy had no idea just how profoundly he'd already changed him. Thomas had once built towers that touched the sky. Now, all he wanted to do was build a life low enough to catch a boy who had once believed he had no one left. The days following Evan's recovery passed with a sense of quiet hope. For the first time in years, Thomas Green felt something resembling peace settle over his soul. He was still adjusting to the idea of fatherhood, still wrestling with the ghosts of regret that trailed behind him, but with every smile from Evan, every small hand gripping his in trust, the weight of his past grew lighter. They were discharged from the hospital with strict instructions for rest, hydration, and regular follow-ups. Thomas took Evan back to his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, a space once sterile and cold, now warmed by the sound of little feet exploring rooms that had never known the echo of a child's laugh. But peace never lasts unchallenged. The first sign of trouble came 2 mornings later, disguised as a man in a rumpled coat, standing by the lobby concierge of Thomas's building. He looked out of place, greasy hair, eyes darting around too quickly, his breath fogging the marble entrance glass as he leaned against the counter. Thomas wouldn't have given it much thought had the man not returned the next day, and the day after. "Do you know him?" Thomas asked Bernard, the doorman, as he passed through. "He's been asking about you," Bernard replied with a furrowed brow. "Claims he's a distant relative of someone named Evan." Thomas's stomach tightened. That afternoon, Thomas received a letter, hand-delivered, no return address. The handwriting was jagged, the ink slightly smudged. "You've got something that isn't yours. I'll be in touch. J." He read it 3 times, each word growing colder with repetition. J, Claire's mother, was an only child. Her father had passed long before Evan was born, but Claire had once mentioned a cousin, Jason, estranged, unstable, the kind of man who appeared at funerals smelling of vodka and bad intentions. Thomas hired a private investigator that same evening. The next 48 hours brought answers and a new wave of dread. Jason Fletcher. No steady employment in the last 5 years. 2 fraud charges, both settled out of court. Most recently, he'd filed a petition with the state claiming to be Evan's next of kin, requesting temporary guardianship while questioning the validity of Thomas's involvement. The man was a stranger to Evan, but that didn't stop him from trying to exploit the situation. It got worse when local gossip blogs caught wind of the story. Real estate mogul secretly raises love child? Thomas Green, building empires and hiding heirs? The headlines were cruel and speculative, with blurry photos of Thomas leaving the hospital with Evan. In one, Evan clutched Thomas's hand tightly. In another, the boy leaned against his chest, asleep. What should have been cherished, private moments had been turned into a sideshow. At the boardroom table 2 days later, the atmosphere was tense. "You need to get ahead of this," one executive said. "The press is painting you into a corner." Another chimed in. "Investors are getting nervous. We're fielding questions about succession plans, about liability. Is there any truth to the rumors?" Thomas, seated at the head of the long glass table, looked at them all calmly. Then he stood. "I won't be bullied into silence. Not by tabloids, not by opportunists, and certainly not by a board that seems more concerned about perception than people." The room went quiet. "I will make a statement, but on my terms." He left the room without waiting for a response. That night, after Evan fell asleep with his head on Thomas's shoulder, during a reading of Where the Wild Things Are, Thomas carried him gently to bed, tucking him in with the same care he used to reserve for his most delicate investments. He stared at the boy for a long time. The next morning, he scheduled a press conference, not in a luxury ballroom or a downtown tower, but in the modest auditorium of St. Matthew's Orphanage. He stood before a crowd of local reporters, orphanage staff, and curious onlookers. "I've built a career on acquiring property, negotiating deals, and expanding reach," Thomas began, his voice steady, deliberate. "But none of that prepared me for what it feels like to find out you have a son." A hush fell over the crowd. He went on to tell the story, about Claire, about their love, about his ignorance and loss. He didn't cry, but his voice trembled at all the right moments. "And now I've been given a second chance. His name is Evan. He's 7 years old. He likes dinosaurs and peanut butter sandwiches, and he's the bravest person I've ever met." He paused. "I'm not here to deny the rumors. I'm here to confirm something far greater than scandal. I'm here to say that love, real love, doesn't need to be hidden." When the conference ended, there were no questions, just applause. Back home, Evan watched the video on TV, eyes wide. "That's you," he said. Thomas smiled, brushing his hand through the boy's hair. "That's us." But just as the air seemed to clear, his phone buzzed with a new notification. "Jason Fletcher has filed an emergency petition for temporary custody. Hearing in 48 hours." Thomas turned off the screen, heart pounding. This fight wasn't over, but for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The courtroom was colder than Thomas expected, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. Pale gray walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, and a faint echo to every sound. The judge's bench stood elevated, imposing, as if daring anyone to lie beneath its gaze. Thomas sat at the respondent's table, hands folded but trembling slightly. Across from him, Jason Fletcher lounged with an air of smug entitlement, wearing an off-the-rack suit that didn't quite fit and a crooked tie that screamed last-minute effort. His attorney, a greasy man named Clive Denton, whispered something in Jason's ear, prompting a toothy grin. The judge, an older woman named Eleanor Marks with a reputation for cutting through nonsense like a scalpel through silk, entered promptly. The bailiff called the room to order. Thomas exhaled slowly, bracing himself. "Mr. Fletcher," Judge Marks began, peering over the rim of her glasses, "you filed for emergency custody of a child you claim is your kin. Present your case." Jason cleared his throat. "Your Honor, Evan is my nephew. His mother, my cousin Claire, passed without listing a guardian. I believe it's my duty to step up and provide him with a stable home." Clive jumped in, oozing rehearsed sincerity. "My client's concern is that the current caretaker, Mr. Green, is exploiting the child for public sympathy. The sudden media appearances, the press conference, these raise questions about intent." Thomas's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected subtlety, but the accusation still landed like a slap. Judge Marks turned to him. "Mr. Green, your response." Thomas stood. "Your Honor, I didn't know Evan existed until a few weeks ago. His mother never told me. But since learning the truth, I've done everything I can to care for him, emotionally, financially, medically. He's my son, Your Honor. I didn't plan this, but I choose him now, every single day." The room fell into a brief, contemplative silence. "Do you have proof of paternity?" the judge asked. Thomas nodded, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "DNA test results, 99.9% match." She took the document from the clerk and reviewed it quietly. Jason shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted, and for a second the facade cracked. "Mr. Fletcher," Judge Marks said after a beat, "have you had any contact with Evan prior to this filing?" Jason hesitated, then offered a weak shrug. "Not directly." "Have you provided support? Financial? Emotional? Any form of consistent involvement?" "No, but are you aware that Evan is currently under the temporary supervision of Mr. Green, who has provided stable housing, paid for his medical care, and taken leave from a multi-million-dollar corporation to be present in his life?" Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. Judge Marks leaned back, arms crossed. "Then I failed to see the emergency." Clive stood, desperation creeping into his voice. "Your Honor, my client was misled by family. He believed Evan was placed into state custody and only recently learned of the situation." "No," she interrupted firmly. "What he recently learned is that the boy's father is wealthy and in the public eye. This petition smells of opportunism." Jason slumped in his chair, defeated. "I will deny the emergency petition," Judge Marks declared, "and I'm ordering a full guardianship hearing within 60 days. Until then, Evan remains under the care of Mr. Green. Case adjourned." Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief and exhaustion flooded him at once. He turned to his attorney and whispered a shaky, "Thank you." Outside the courtroom, a few reporters loitered, but Thomas ignored them. He wasn't here for headlines. He was here for Evan. Back at the penthouse, Evan was waiting with Ms. Reynolds, the warm, silver-haired nanny Thomas had hired on a temporary basis. When the boy saw him walk through the door, he ran forward, arms outstretched. "You're back," Evan exclaimed, wrapping around his waist like a vine of hope. "I told you I would be," Thomas murmured, crouching down and hugging him tightly. Evan pulled back slightly, searching his face. "Did the judge say I have to go live with that man?" Thomas shook his head, gently brushing the boy's hair out of his eyes. "No, buddy. She said you stay right here, where you belong." Evan grinned, then leaned in close. "I was kinda scared." Thomas's voice softened, cracking slightly. "Me too. But we're okay now. We're together." That night, Thomas sat on the couch, Evan curled against him, half asleep with a picture book resting on his chest. The city lights blinked outside, distant and uncaring, but inside, warmth filled every corner. His phone vibrated. A text from the board's PR advisor. "Media outlets are shifting tone. Headlines now call you devoted father who fought for his son. Good move with the courthouse setting." He didn't respond. He didn't care. None of it mattered more than the steady sound of his son's breath against his side. Later, as Thomas carried Evan to bed and tucked him in, the boy blinked up at him sleepily. "You won't leave, right?" Thomas smiled through misty eyes. "Not ever. I promise." He turned off the light and stood by the door, watching the rise and fall of Evan's chest. In that moment, Thomas Green realized he'd spent decades chasing legacy in glass towers and concrete contracts, but his real legacy was already asleep down the hall. The press conference was set for 10 a.m., but Thomas Green arrived at the modest Southside Community Center nearly an hour early. Not because he needed to prepare. His remarks were handwritten, folded neatly in his inside coat pocket, but because he needed the silence before the storm. There were no marble columns, no glittering chandeliers like the spaces he usually commanded, just plastic chairs, a worn podium, and a few rows of local press setting up cameras with duct tape and frayed extension cords. But that was precisely the point. Thomas didn't want spectacle. He wanted truth. He looked down at his phone, the lock screen still showing Evan's drawing from the night before, two stick figures holding hands, labeled "Me and Dad" in scrawled blue marker. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Green, we're ready when you are." Thomas nodded. He stepped up to the podium, the hush in the room falling over him like snowfall. Camera lights flicked on. Reporters raised their pens. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he unfolded the page in his hand slowly, then looked up, his voice quiet but steady. "My name is Thomas Green. For years, people have known me as a real estate developer, a businessman, a figure in the Chicago skyline. But today, I'm here as something far more important, a father." A murmur passed through the room. "I didn't know I had a son, not until a few weeks ago, during a visit to a children's home I sponsor. A little boy named Evan pointed to my photograph on the wall and whispered, 'That's my dad.' And in that moment, everything I thought I knew about myself, my past, my future, shifted." He paused, letting the words settle. "I want to tell you about Evan's mother, Claire. She was the first person I ever truly loved. We met in college. She was a painter, a free spirit with a laugh that could make the whole room stop. But my family, they didn't approve. They told me she wasn't our kind of people. And, like a coward, I listened. I let her walk away." The rawness in his voice made the cameras feel distant, irrelevant. "She never told me she was pregnant. I don't know if it was to protect me or out of pride or pain, but she raised Evan alone. She left him in safety when she couldn't care for him any longer. She gave him everything she had until there was nothing left. And that boy, he's kind, brave, smart, and full of more heart than I've ever seen in a person half my size." Thomas swallowed hard, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm not here to salvage my reputation. I'm not here to get ahead of a scandal. I'm here because that little boy deserves the truth. He deserves to know that his father may have arrived late, but he's not leaving." A few reporters blinked rapidly, some lowering their pens as if unsure how to capture the emotion they were witnessing. "I've made mistakes. I've hidden behind contracts and conference rooms, behind wealth and reputation. But this is the most important role I've ever had. Not CEO, not developer, Dad." He closed the speech quietly. "And to Evan, if you're watching this from home, I love you. I loved you the second I heard your voice, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that again." He stepped away from the podium to stunned silence. One reporter finally spoke, voice soft. "Mr. Green, what do you say to those who think this is just damage control?" Thomas looked her in the eye. "I say, let them think what they want. My son knows the truth, and that's enough." That afternoon, Evan sat cross-legged on the carpet, watching the live stream replay on a tablet beside Ms. Reynolds. When Thomas came through the door, the boy ran to him without a word and threw his arms around his waist. "You meant it?" Evan asked, muffled into Thomas's coat. "Every word," Thomas whispered. Later, Thomas received an unexpected email from Claire's cousin, Melissa. The subject line read, "She would have been proud." The message was short. "Claire wrote about you sometimes. She never stopped believing in the better version of you. Thank you for finding it." That night, as they sat at the kitchen table making a mess of a mac and cheese from scratch, Evan looked up from his plate and grinned. "You're pretty good at this." Thomas laughed. "At cooking?" "No," Evan said, dipping his spoon dramatically. "At being a dad." Thomas looked at the boy, his boy, and felt something in his chest finally fall into place. "I'm learning from the best," he said. And in that little kitchen, under warm light and laughter, it didn't matter what the headlines said or who doubted him, because the only person who needed convincing already believed. The early winter sun filtered through the windows of Thomas's townhouse, casting golden rays onto the hardwood floor. The light danced across the walls, illuminating a home that had once felt more like a showroom than a place to live. Now it was littered with traces of life: a pair of small sneakers by the door, a papier-mâché rocket ship on the dining table, and hand-drawn pictures taped unevenly along the hallway. Thomas stood in the kitchen, wearing an apron covered in flour and cartoon dogs. He held a bowl of pancake batter with one hand while his other attempted, unsuccessfully, to flip a stubborn blueberry pancake. From behind him came a soft giggle. "You're supposed to wait until the bubbles show," Evan said matter-of-factly, standing on a step-stool with his arms crossed. Thomas turned, mock defeated. "Well, excuse me, Chef Green. Care to demonstrate for your old man?" Evan hopped down, confidently picking up the spatula. "Watch and learn," he said, and with practiced precision, flipped the pancake to perfection. Thomas couldn't help but beam. The boy was already more capable in the kitchen than he'd ever been at that age, than he was now, truthfully. Their routine had started to take shape. Every morning, they cooked breakfast together. Every evening, they ended the day with a story or a board game, the fireplace humming gently in the background. And every night, before bed, Thomas would tuck Evan in, whispering words he never grew tired of saying. "I'm right here, always." That morning, after breakfast, Evan scurried off to get ready for school while Thomas loaded the dishwasher. As he placed the last plate inside, he paused, staring down at the sink with a quiet kind of reverence. It wasn't about the dishes. It was about the rhythm of ordinary life, something he'd never known he craved until now. "Ready!" Evan called from the stairs, backpack strapped, coat half-zipped, his hair a little wild. Thomas chuckled. "You look like a tornado with legs." Evan grinned. "Ms. Connie says that too." Thomas grabbed his keys. "Let's drop the tornado off at school then." As they stepped outside, Thomas felt the cold air bite his cheeks, but it didn't bother him. Evan slipped his small hand into his, and that was enough warmth for a lifetime. Later that afternoon, after the school drop-off and a few business calls he ended early because, as he now reminded his assistant, "I've got more important things to do," Thomas found himself in front of a long-forgotten storage unit. He'd asked his driver to meet him there, a little uneasily. The unit was dusty, untouched for years, holding the remnants of his past, the life he'd boxed up after Claire left. As the door groaned open, the stale scent of old paper and cedar hit him. He stepped inside cautiously, scanning the boxes until he found one marked Claire, 2002. He hesitated before opening it. Inside were photographs, scribbled love notes, sketches Claire had done of cityscapes and parks where they used to walk, and a journal. Thomas sat on the cold cement floor, brushing dust off the leather-bound cover. He opened to a page near the middle, dated January 2002. "He doesn't believe me." I saw the fear in his eyes, not fear of the baby, but of the truth. That love means losing control. I couldn't make him see it, not through the fog his family created. I walked away not because I wanted to, but because I had to protect our son. Maybe one day he'll find us. Maybe he won't. Either way, I won't stop loving him. And I won't stop loving the boy who carries his eyes. Thomas swallowed hard. His hands trembled. He whispered, "I'm so sorry, Claire." Back at the townhouse that evening, Evan came home from school bouncing with energy, his backpack thudding as he tossed it by the door. "Guess what?" he exclaimed, running into the kitchen. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What?" "I'm in the spelling bee finals. Ms. Connie says I spelled philosophy better than any fourth grader she's ever had." Thomas crouched down and lifted Evan into a hug. "That's amazing, kiddo. We've got a scholar in the house." Evan's voice dropped to a whisper. "Will you come watch me?" Thomas looked at him, his voice catching in his throat. "Nothing in the world could stop me." That night, Thomas pulled out the journal again. He tucked it carefully into the bookshelf next to Evan's favorite bedtime stories. When Evan noticed, he asked, "What's that?" Thomas answered softly, "It's from your mom. Maybe one day, when you're ready, we'll read it together." Evan nodded, curling up beside his father on the couch. "I think she'd be happy," he said quietly. Thomas wrapped an arm around him. "I know she would be." The flicker of the fire cast warm light across the room. On the wall behind them, a new photo frame had just been hung. Thomas and Evan at the community center fundraiser last week, laughing as they posed with whipped cream on their noses. For the first time in his life, Thomas wasn't building towers or sealing deals. He was building something far more valuable. A home. The morning of the school art fair dawned with a light dusting of snow, coating the rooftops of Chicago in a peaceful hush. Inside Thomas's townhouse, laughter echoed from the hallway. Evan, dressed in his corduroy overalls and a green turtleneck, his presentation outfit, stood in front of the mirror trying to flatten his stubborn hair. "Dad, it's still sticking up," he groaned. Thomas appeared behind him, gently tousling the hair back into place with a grin. "It has a mind of its own, just like you." Evan crossed his arms with mock seriousness. "Today's important. I'm showing the painting." "I know," Thomas said, kneeling beside him, his voice warm. "And no matter what happens, I already know it's the most beautiful painting there." "Because it's about us," Evan whispered, almost shyly. That made Thomas pause. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Yeah, because it's about us. They arrived at the school just before the gymnasium doors opened. The room was buzzing with parents, teachers, and classmates, the scent of finger paint, construction paper, and fresh-baked cookies drifting in the air. Tables lined the walls, each student's work proudly displayed with hand-lettered name tags and colorful decorations. Thomas scanned the room until he saw it. There, pinned to a large foam board, was Evan's painting. It was simple, sweet, and achingly profound. A swirling sky of blues and purples, with two stick figures holding hands on a cloud. One tall, one small. Above them was a sun with a gentle smile and tiny wings. Beside it, Evan had written in large block letters, "Me and my dad on the clouds. I think my mom is watching us from there. She's smiling because now we're together." Thomas blinked hard against the sting in his eyes. A woman next to him whispered, "Is that your boy's work? It's beautiful." He nodded, unable to speak. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the cookies were half gone, Thomas knelt in front of Evan. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why the clouds?" Evan looked down at his scuffed sneakers, then back up at his father, his expression thoughtful. "Because I like thinking we're closer to her there. Like if we just reach high enough we can almost hear her." Thomas swallowed. I think she'd be really proud of you." Evan grinned. "Of us." They walked home that evening, bundled in scarves and laughter. The city lights twinkled above them, snowflakes clinging to their eyelashes. Evan talked non-stop about how someone asked for a print of his painting and how he might sell copies to raise money for the shelter's art supplies. "You're already starting a business," Thomas teased. "Guess it runs in the blood." Back home, the townhouse felt cozier than usual. The fireplace crackled softly, and the aroma of hot cocoa filled the air. Evan sat at the dining table drawing another picture while Thomas cleaned up from dinner. As he was wiping the counter, Thomas noticed something new taped to the fridge. Another drawing, this time a family portrait. Evan stood in the middle, flanked by a woman with long hair and a kind smile, and a tall man with Thomas's strong jaw and deep-set eyes. All three were holding hands beneath a sky filled with stars. In the corner, in small neat handwriting, Evan had added, "Family means staying, even when it's hard." Thomas stared at the words, overwhelmed. He thought about everything that had changed. How one photo in a hallway had unraveled a truth he never knew he needed. How the boy he didn't know existed had healed wounds buried deep beneath the surface. How love, real and fierce and unconditional, had arrived when he least expected it. "Dad?" Evan's voice called from the living room. "Yeah, buddy?" "I finished my new picture." Thomas walked over and sat beside him. "Can I see it?" Evan turned the page around. It was a simple image, just the two of them sitting on a park bench, their silhouettes outlined by a big, glowing moon. Above them, scrawled in silver crayon, were the words, "Me and my dad. Right here, forever." Thomas pulled him close, hugging him tightly. "You're my whole world, Evan. And you're mine," the boy whispered, resting his head against Thomas's chest. As the fire dimmed and the city fell into a quiet hush, Thomas placed Evan's drawings in a folder, careful as if handling gold. He walked to the hallway and hung the latest picture beside the others. The once empty wall was now full of color and life, each piece a testament to the journey they had taken together. From sterile boardrooms to an orphanage hallway, from silence to bedtime stories, from regret to redemption. He whispered a silent prayer of thanks, to Claire, to fate, to second chances. And as snow began to fall gently against the window panes, Thomas knew, without doubt, without hesitation, that this was where he was always meant to be. Not in skyscrapers, not in conference rooms, but here, on a cloud, beside a boy who called him Dad.